The Victorian school life. Although schools have always been around, it wasn't until the Victorian era that these were improved considerably and available for all children, rich and poor. In 1870, a law was passed which made it compulsory for all children aged between 5 and 10 in Britain to attend school. Now, this was similar to the system we have today of Monday to Friday, however the leaving age was far lower. The leaving age was then increased to 11 in 1893. However, parents and some employers of working class children still prevented some of them from going to school as they were making money in the workplace, and this is what they wanted. In 1870, there were 14 voluntary schools in Colchester. Some examples of these schools included the Royal Grammar School, St John's Green, St Paul's and St Peter's. Who went to school? Well, when Queen Victoria initially came to the throne, schools were just for the rich. Children of the wealthy would go to fee-paying schools where they would learn classical subjects such as Latin and Greek and study classical history such as Greek mythology and classical literature about Roman gods and goddesses. Most children never went to school and struggled to read and write. Children from rich families were typically taught at home by a governess until the age of about 10 years old. Wealthy boys at the age of 10 would then go to public schools such as the Rugby. Girls, on the other hand, continued to be educated at home. The poor were initially introduced to schools thanks to the Sunday school introduced by a chap called Robert Raikes. This was all turned around on its head, however, in 1870, with the passing of the law, and schools began to cater for the rich and the poor. Various names were given to schools, including the British schools and the ragged schools, the latter getting the name for the poor children who attended the school. So what were the Victorian schools like? Well, Victorian schools are certainly different to the schools we have today. Within poor inner city areas, there could be anything between 70 and 80 pupils in just one class. The schools themselves were imposing buildings with high windows to prevent the children from seeing out of, and the walls of the schools lacked creativity and were quite often just bare. Village schools typically had smaller classes. However, the age gaps would be very varied. It wasn't uncommon to see a 6-year-old child working in the same classroom as a 10-year-old. Due to the size of the small school classrooms, it became very regimented and adopted a significant amount of repetition. Usually this consisted of the classroom teacher writing on a chalkboard and the children copying this down. Teaching lacked creativity, and it was strict, uncomfortable, and an uncomfortable place for children to begin their life of education. In Victorian schools, there were more female teachers than male ones, with the women occupying the majority of teaching roles. These women were often very strict and scary. The majority of female teachers were unmarried ladies, and they were called Miss all the time. The reason teaching consisted merely of ladies was due to the pay scale. The salaries were poor, and the men could be earning much more money elsewhere. So it was left up to the women. The rationale behind it being mostly unmarried women, well then once they're married, the women would then be expected to care for their own family. The large majority of teachers did not have a college education. The role of teaching was something they picked up while on the job, and every lesson could be a challenge for them too. The teaching was also passed on to some of the brightest children in some schools known as monitors, where they would be taught by the headmaster and would then pass on be passed on to small groups of children in another way of educating. The Victorian teaching system was much different to the one that we have today. Punishment and discipline in schools. Well, discipline was huge in Victorian times, and this was no different in schools. Well, it wasn't uncommon for children to be beaten by a cane, which was a piece of birch wood. Boys were typically caned on the backside, whereas girls would take the punishment on their legs or hands. The reasons ranged from truancy right through to just laziness in the classroom, and the punishments were often harsh and painful for children who were just aged between 5 and 10. Children who were slower than the rest within the lessons were made to wear shameful dunce hats and sit in a corner for over an hour. This was not only humiliating for the child, but also not helping them to actually speed up to the rest of the class. At the time, there was no concept of children with learning difficulties, and the undereducated classroom teachers would assume that it was purely down to laziness or a lack of effort. Amazingly, children were reprimanded for using their left hand to write. This was seen as a punishment offence, and they were made to write with their right hand. What were the lessons that they were taught? Well, in terms of lessons, they were very basic and focused on the 3 R's of reading, writing and arithmetic, which was maths, with the introduction of religion to make this a not so fantastic 4. The initial 3 was seen as the most important areas of education at the time, and a vast majority of school time involved the learning of these. The lessons were very different to lessons of today and usually involved copying down what the teacher wrote on the chalkboard. Furthermore, children were expected to chant things out loud until they did so without any mistakes. The times tables were commonly done in this way, and children were expected to do this without any mistakes at all. The importance of developing a fine hand in writing was high, and alongside numbers, this was seen as a crucial part of education. The school days in Victorian times were structured and very different to today, with the morning starting off consisting with prayers and religious instructions. This was commonly followed by morning lessons running from 9 a.m. until 12 noon. Followed by this was a lunch period where the children usually went home. This was similar to their fathers who went to home for work. And within the Victorian period, the children would do the same. Afternoon lessons then began at 2 p.m. and finished at 5 p.m. The school day in Victorian times was in the mould of the modern day 9 till 5. Children of very young age were expected to maintain their best attendance and attention at all times and endure the rules of the school.